Okay. Welcome to this panel on communication policy that's titled Race, Gender, and Media Policy in Challenging Times. If you look at the program, the dean was scheduled to do the welcome, but unfortunately she's unable to be here today with us. So I'll take this opportunity to go ahead and welcome everyone, particularly our guests that have taken their time out to be here, including one of our former professors, Dr. Clint Wilson. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, this really is a panel discussion that is timely. As you know, we have a new administration, and these are challenging times as well. The panelists that we have here are people who have been working in this field of policy making in communication. And today you would hear them out in terms of their views. But the first thing that I really want to talk about is also to introduce you to the Howard Media Group. The Howard Media Group has been here since 2009 under the leadership of Dr. Caroline Bailey. We now have two co-chairs for that Howard Media Group. The other co-chair, apart from Dr. Bailey, is Dr. Young Jin Park. Unfortunately, he's unable to be here today because he has an emergency. But we also have members of the Howard Media Group, and at this time I would ask them to please stand so that they can be recognized. Now you would note that this is a group that includes not just professors but graduate students as well. And these graduate students have really been instrumental to moving things along in terms of the group's work. And the group has done quite a lot. Some of you may have heard some of the work that the group has done, but I would point out that the group's focus really is to make sure that communication policy in the United States of America recognizes the importance of public interest. You may think that this is easy enough, but that's not the case. It's something that you have to fight to make sure that public interest is recognized in any policy making that takes place. And that's one of the things that this group really wants to make sure that is being done. Howard University, as you know, is a place for social justice. And that is really the link between what HMG, Howard Media Group, does and what Howard University's goal is. So HMG fights for social justice, but in this case, in terms of communication policy making. The other thing also is that HMG fights for equal access to communication. We monitor policy making, and we also conduct research, academic research, and sponsor educational events and other relevant events that take place. Now, for today's panel, I would ask you, if you're tweeting, we have a hashtag which says #HMG chat. That's where you should tweet, and that's where the action would be. And as you also know, today it's being live streamed. Now, why do we have this panel? As I said, this panel is set up and it is timely because we have a new administration. But beyond having a new administration, there has been struggle in communication policy that had been ongoing, even under the Obama presidency. There have been struggles. But more importantly, the new FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, is well known, and his views are well known. He has already talked about abolishing net neutrality, which is something that people had fought for a long time. And I believe this will be an issue for the next 4 years, hopefully. Then he has also indicated that he's going to be going for deregulation, further deregulation. Essentially what that means is that some of the things that HMG fights for, which is in the public interest, may be ignored if the arena itself is deregulated. So these are some of the issues that are out there, and some of the issues that I have not mentioned will also be discussed today. But the other thing also that he has said, which is really troubling, is the issue that he is going to remove the current restrictions on mergers of major companies. Essentially what this means is that the market itself is left to regulate itself. This means the consumers may not be protected. This is some of the things that we face today. The other issue that has come up also is that in the courts, there has been issues about ownership, particularly dealing with women and minority ownership, and even issues that have been won in court. FCC has been very slow implementing those issues. And you can imagine what it would be under this new administration. What it means is not only should we have a public dialogue, like the type that we are having today, it means also that we have to be prepared for what is coming in the years ahead. Part of that preparation, HMG is taking part in that preparation. Some of the things that would come out from this discussion would be things that HMG would look at, including fully understanding what the public interest is and making sure that FCC understands from our own viewpoint what that public interest is, particularly as it pertains to women and people of color. The person who will be facilitating all of this today, who will be moderating this event, is Dr. Caroline Bailey. And she would move on to introduce the panel and get us started today. So I'm going to call on Dr. Bailey to go ahead. Thank you.
How do I turn the mic on?
Is it on?
Is it on? Yes. Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you here because I know there are some other competing events on campus and also in the community. I'm going to introduce the panelists and then ask them to speak one at a time, about 15 minutes each. I'm delighted to have this particular group of people, some of whom I've been working with about 10 years on these issues, give up their time and come today. Dr. Clint Wilson, my former colleague here, we look for excuses to get him back and share his great, vast knowledge about media. He is going to speak about the history of the struggle for media access by women and people of color. Dr. Wilson is the Professor Emeritus of the Department of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies here at Howard. He received his EDD from the University of Southern California, and he's the author of 7 books, including Wither the Black Press and Racism, Sexism, and the Media. And he was also an original founding member of Howard Media Group. Carmen Scorado is the Director of Policy and Legal Affairs for the National Hispanic Media Coalition. She is the Director of Policy and Legal Affairs there, and she's a native of Puerto Rico. She received her JD from Villanova University School of Law, and she previously worked as an investigator for the U.S. Department of Justice on cases of fraud in healthcare and other industries. Andrew J. Schwartzman, who is the Benton Senior Counselor at the Institute for Public Representation at Georgetown Law Center, is going to address what have we gained, assessing legal action to block conglomeration and to expand access. Andy is the Benton Senior Counselor at the IPS at Georgetown Law Center. He received his JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and he's an expert in the public interest and communications law and policy. He was previously the director of the Media Access Project and the lead attorney for the Prometheus Radio Project versus the FCC, which has been 3 rounds in court, and whose ruling prevented further deregulation in media industries and required the FCC to address low levels of women and minority ownership in broadcast. And I think his update on that will not be very uplifting, but it's incredibly important. Joycelyn Tate, who is somewhere stuck in traffic around an accident and hopefully will be joining us momentarily, is with the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and the Black Women's Roundtable. She is a senior technology policy advisor with those 2 organizations, where she serves as a strategist and policy advocate specializing in telecommunications law and policy issues. She received her JD from Catholic University of America, and she worked previously for the Federal Communications Commission and the Minority Media and Telecommunications Council. And with that, I will stop and ask Dr. Wilson to kick us off.
Thank you, Dr. Byerly. Oh, I'm going to take this one.
Yeah, because we're taping.
Okay. The year was 1847, and the era of mass communications media in the United States was in its infancy. Only 14 years had elapsed since the 1833 founding of the New York Sun ushered in the age of the penny press. Prior to this, public communications media took the form of subsidized, politically partisan publications with other printed entities targeted at business and commercial interest. By this time, ethnic and cultural minority groups had already seen the need to publish their own alternative newspapers to foster their community identities and coalesce around issues of mutual concern. It was the penny press era, with its content appealing to the less sophisticated mass white audience, that encouraged the growth of commercial advertising and the rise of the media oligarchy. This enabled information and entertainment to become commodities for profitable exploitation of the mass audience. It is this pay-to-play concept that underlies our 21st century media discussion today. The specific event to which I call your attention occurred during this period that American historians have labeled the age of the common man. The administration of Andrew Jackson, the first president to be elected by the white populist masses, was only a decade past its second term, and the wealthy elite and mercantile class was not eager to yield power again. These were the people of whom Jackson said, quote, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their own selfish purposes," end of quote. So in 1847, the privileged elites of New York State were in a political tizzy over whether the free black citizens should be given equitable voting rights. The state constitution contained a clause that extended voting eligibility to all white males who had attained the age of 20, and to free black men of age who additionally were required to own a minimum of $250 in real estate, the equivalent of $2,615 in today's marketplace, and with the condition that all taxes on said property were current and paid in full. You are permitted to draw comparisons to similar voting restrictions in 21st century America. As you may imagine, black citizens protested this blatant inequality in the law and made their feelings known through a petition submitted to the state legislature. Of particular interest to us is they also sought to express themselves in the pages of the New York Sun, then among the largest circulated and influential newspapers in the nation. Because of its status as the first newspaper published for the common man, the Sun proudly proclaimed in its masthead the motto, "It shines for all." And the word all was printed in capital letters to emphasize that this mass medium's inclusiveness. The New York Sun of the 1840s can be generally equated to the corporate media of today. In fact, Andrew Jackson might find the historical actions of our modern Federal Communications Commission have tended, in his words, to bend toward the selfish interests of the rich and powerful. As we pick up our story, we find that the New York State Legislature, embroiled in a hotly debated controversy over what is to be done about voting rights for free African Americans in a nation that openly espouses the idea of social equality for the common man. The legislature courageously decided that the matter of voting privileges for black citizens be placed on the ballot for resolution by the all-white electorate. As whites of varying political stripes debated the issue openly and without financial charge in the opinion pages of the New York Sun, the perspective from the African American community was conspicuously absent. It was as if everyone in the room was expounding on the voting rights issue except the affected black persons who resided in their midst. Eventually, the task of expressing the African American perspective, we're okay? Okay, to white voters fell to a respected community leader named Willis Hodges. It is in his name that I wish to dedicate my portion of these proceedings today. The New York Sun, the epitome of social inclusion and the profitable beneficiary of mass media commercialization, was the recipient of a well-crafted, rational letter to the editor written by Willis Hodges. In his letter, Hodges enumerated to New York citizens the reasons why African Americans supported a yes vote on the question of voting rights for black citizens. Unfortunately, Hodges' letter was not well received by the New York Sun's editor, who promptly took the following actions. 1, he decided to unilaterally alter Hodges' article to his liking. 2, instead of publishing the letter in the paper's opinion section, he placed it among the advertisements. And then 3, sent Hodges an invoice for $15 with the note declaring that the Sun's columns were not open to black people, and admonished that if Hodges wanted to express his opinions, he should start his own newspaper. Well, we meet today exactly 170 years after Willis Hodges was denied access to a public but privately owned mass media enterprise. It is true that in 1847, the most strident publication supporting African Americans was The Liberator, published by white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. However, despite its stance against slavery, Garrison's Liberator was problematic because its tone smacked of paternalism. The Liberator often published articles by Frederick Douglass, and Garrison considered him as his foremost editorial contributor. But when Douglass sought to start his own black-oriented newspaper, Garrison discouraged the idea and was angered at the prospect of losing a key element of his financially successful enterprise. Later that same year, 1847, after being rebuffed by white media power brokers at the New York Sun, Willis Hodges accepted their challenge to start his own newspaper. He didn't initially have the capital to start his publication, so he took up a side business as a whitewasher, doing odd jobs in his community. Within a few months, Hodges used the earnings to start a weekly newspaper called The Ram's Horn, to provide an outlet for black citizens of New York wherein they could express their opinions and exchange exchange ideas on public issues. Thank you. Now, the financially strapped ram's horn was predictably short-lived, and it ceased publication within a few weeks. But Historical Review reveals a nondescript item that appeared in the very first issue of the Ram's Horn. It was the announcement of a business prospectus for a new weekly newspaper to be called the North Star, under ownership of Frederick Douglass. Thus, Willis Hodges cemented his role as a key figure in the cause for mass media equality in the United States. Now, moving forward nearly 9 decades, we find the post-World War I rise of radio technology, marking the beginning of electronic mass communication in America. Because the laws of physics limit availability of broadcasting frequencies, they became valuable commodities. Thus, Congress enacted the Communications Act of 1934 with the policy declaring the airwaves to be administered for the public's, quote, convenience, interest, and necessity, end quote. In other words, accessibility and ownership would be available for all. Sound familiar? So, some 87 years after Willis Hodges was denied access to a privately owned mass communication medium, the pay-to-play phenomenon became a fixture of the new electronic communications age under the aegis of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. As technological advances occurred, the subsequent platforms of television, wire, satellite, and cable have fallen under FCC purview. In much the same manner as the New York Sun failed to meet its own standard of being open to all citizens, the FCC has generally failed to ensure equality of public access for women and minority groups in favor of privately owned corporations. Over the past 170 years since the Willis Hodges incident, people of color, women, and other marginalized groups have found themselves in continuous struggle to establish meaningful footholds in the universe of public discourse in a nation where moneyed privilege reigns supreme in public affairs. Indeed, Willis Hodges would easily recognize today's mass media in the United States as being much like the challenges he faced 170 years ago. The bottom line is that segments of American society still find themselves treated as subjects in the room, while others, the FCC, corporate media entities, Congress, and the courts, debate their worthiness to be full contributors with ownership rights and opportunities. Indeed, as Andrew Jackson might say, the actions of these hegemonic forces have tended to bend toward the selfish interests of the rich and powerful. In today's digital communications era, the marginalized and disfranchised are seen primarily as commodity audiences for profit exploitation in a media landscape that largely presents them through stereotypical lenses. Hopefully, as you listen to and participate in the discussions to follow, you will find ways to join and support the important struggle in which our panelists are engaged. During our discussion today, we are likely to hear mention of key historical actions in the development of communications policy in the United States. They may include references to the Communications Acts of 1934 and its 1996 iteration, or the 2 Prometheus Radio Project court decisions, or the ramifications of deregulation and open internet access. Please know that throughout history, disfranchised groups in the United States have always needed to employ what I term the 3 A's to combat inequalities in mass media industries. They are to obtain access through advocacy and use of alternative media strategies. In that context, our panelists will address and discuss public policy issues that determine our communications future. Although 21st century advances in technology have brought new challenges to attaining full rights as participants in and owners of American communications entities, you will learn that our challenges have deep historical roots which remain formidable. But the spirit of Willis Hodges expects no less of us than to accept those challenges. Thank you.
So I wanted to give you a little bit of background about the National Hispanic Media Coalition. We're a 30-year-old media advocacy and civil rights organization for the advancement of Latinos. So we believe that inclusion, racial justice, and progressive social change are impossible in the absence of a fair and equitable media. So to carry out our mission at NHMC, we work to ensure a media that is fair and inclusive of Latinos, and we advocate for federal policies that expand access to affordable and open communications. So we achieve our goals as an organization through our advocacy work at the FCC and by educating policymakers in Congress. Under the Obama administration, we had several victories, including the FCC's Open Internet Order of 2015, or net neutrality, and the Lifeline Modernization Order of 2016. So what is the legislative landscape of communications policies in the 115th Congress? I mean, if I had to describe it in one word, it would be challenging. How has landscapes changed since the last Congress? Well, we have a Republican president. We have a Republican-led FCC with Chairman Ajit Pai as the chair, and a Republican majority in Congress as well. So what this means, and what we said earlier, is it's going to mean more deregulation, and we'll see legislation that benefits industry and media gatekeepers, all at the detriment of consumers, communities of color, and the poor. But before we dive into the weeds, I think it's best to first give an overview of the makeup of Congress and the 2 key congressional communications committees, as well as highlight a few lawmakers that could have a profound impact on communications policies. And second, I'm going to talk about the current legislation that we've seen come out of the House and the Senate, with a special emphasis on the resolutions introduced under the Congressional Review Act to roll back the FCC's broadband privacy regulations. And third, I'm going to talk about legislation that we can potentially see in the future and what we should look out for. So first, the breakdown of our current Congress. In the House of Representatives, we have 240 Republicans, including 1 delegate and the resident commissioner of Puerto Rico, 197 Democrats, and 4 vacant seats. In the Senate, there are 52 Republicans, 46 Democrats, and 2 independents who caucus with the Democrats. And now to move on to the committees. In the House, there's the Communications and Technology Subcommittee. And the new chair of that subcommittee is Marsha Blackburn. And she's a Republican from Tennessee. And so what does it mean now that Blackburn is in charge? Well, the leadership in these committees is a good predictor of where policy is going moving forward. And so I've looked at her past statements. And one of the things we know about Representative Blackburn is that she's a strong opponent of net neutrality. And for example, back in 2015, she introduced the Internet Freedom Act. And this was her attempt to overturn the FCC's net neutrality rules. And second, she's also an opponent of Lifeline. And Lifeline, for many of you who are not familiar with it, it's a very important federal program that provides a modest subsidy to low-income Americans for telephone and now broadband service. And she called Lifeline a failed Lifeline Obama phone program, and I'm quoting her, that needs to be abolished. It symbolizes how the culture of government dependency is weakening America. And something else we know about Representative Blackburn is that she doesn't support the FCC's broadband privacy rules. And just yesterday, she introduced a resolution under the Congressional Review Act, also known as the CRA, in the House to roll back the FCC's broadband privacy rules. So I think what we can see from Blackburn is exactly what I said earlier about Congress generally, is that she will be focused on rolling back many of the gains that we had under the Obama administration that protect consumers, but also the poor in our society. And now to move on to the Senate. The Senate Communications Subcommittee is chaired by Senator John Thune. And we saw a little bit actually yesterday. They had an FCC oversight hearing. So we had an idea of where he was going to go, but we've also known Senator Thune for a while. And he's also an avid opponent of net neutrality. And net neutrality as it stands now in the FCC, because he wrote a op-ed in Ars Technica just this March 3rd, and it was called Protect the Open Internet with a Bipartisan Law. So this is his plan for net neutrality. He calls the FCC's open internet order misguided regulatory approach that has chilled investment. He says the internet is now at the mercy of the fickle government officials, and that the regulatory uncertainty inevitably creates disincentives and does not allow companies to innovate. And so what he's calling for is clear and enduring rules that balance innovation and investment for all parts of the internet ecosystem. So let's be clear, what he's talking about is taking the power out of the hands of the FCC. And this legislation is not going to address concerns of the average consumers, small business owners, or creators who have been able to thrive under the FCC's open internet rules. So this is very similar to Blackburn. What we can expect from Thune is the rollback from all these gains, with a special focus, again, on dismantling net neutrality and stripping the FCC of its legal authority to regulate broadband as a public utility. So I want to actually shift a little bit and tell you some about the current legislation that we've seen come out of the House and Senate. And I alluded to it earlier. It's the Congressional Review Act. And there's two resolutions that were introduced. One by Senator Jeff Flake in the Senate, and it was a resolution, again, to roll back the FCC's broadband privacy rules. And Marsha Blackburn introduced the same resolution in the House. So to give you a little bit of background about the FCC's broadband privacy rules, they're from October 2016, so very, very recent. And the rules prevent broadband providers from tracking the online behavior of customers without their permission. So the rules would create a clear requirements for broadband carriers to protect customers' personal information, and also require carriers to notify customers in the event of a data breach. So right now, your internet service provider can collect all of this information, and what these rules were set to do is create an opt-in and an opt-out program depending on the level of the level of privacy and the level of sensitivity of that personal information. So now with these resolutions that have been introduced in both the House and the Senate, this is an attempt to overturn rules that empower users to gives them a say in how these internet service providers can use their information, their personal and private information. And the CRA, it's dangerous for various reasons, but I think one of the most important reasons to highlight here is that even though it's an ordinary legislation, it is not subject to a filibuster in the Senate. And the other very troubling part of the CRA is that if it does actually pass, it prevents the FCC from creating any rules that are substantially similar. So again, that this would strip power away from the FCC. So not only will consumers' private information remain in the hands of their internet service providers, but it's also going to preclude the FCC from requiring data breach notifications. And it wouldn't allow the FCC to revisit these rules as technology continues to evolve. So that's the current legislative landscape. That was just a brief highlight, but I want to talk about also future legislation that we can see. And I've already again talked about this, but I can certainly see that we'll see net neutrality legislation introduced at some point in this 115th Congress. I think it's inevitable, and we heard a lot about this in yesterday's FCC oversight hearing in the Senate. And I mean, one of the things that I thought was interesting and that stuck with me is that Senator Blumenthal and I'm paraphrasing him here, but he asked, if you're going to amend, he asked this to Chairman Pai, if you're going to amend the net neutrality order, you would need to make this as part of a rulemaking, correct? And Chairman Pai, he didn't really directly answer the question, but he said he would commit to following the Administrative Procedure Act. So it's something, but it's interesting that was one of the questions that was asked, and that he did commit to at least following the APA. But we don't know whether it's necessary to do a rulemaking in order for him to walk back or amend some parts of the FCC's open internet order. And the other thing that I want to emphasize that we have to look for moving forward is broadband infrastructure or broadband deployment legislation. So Chairman Pai has stated that his primary focus as chair is going to be to bridge the digital divide. And Republicans in Congress also support this, and they've said that they also want to bridge the digital divide. But I think we have to be very careful about what this means, because the digital divide for them means it's very narrowly focused on legislation that is incentivizing broadband deployment to rural areas and possibly doing this through tax incentives. And what I'm concerned with, and what many of us are concerned with, is the digital divide more broadly, which is really the economic and opportunity divide that exists between those that have broadband and those that do not, even in areas where we can have access to broadband. So although it is very important for rural areas to get connected, the Republican rhetoric fails to address the main barrier to home broadband adoption, which is cost. So simply put, there are just many low-income families who could have access to broadband but cannot afford to pay the steep prices set by these large service providers. The digital divide, it's a bipartisan issue, and if Republicans want to make a meaningful impact in the digital divide, I think we need to push them to also focus on tackling this issue of affordability and ensuring that low-income families in areas with broadband can also afford to get online. And I think, although we have an uphill battle, we must be willing to fight. Thank you.
These have been two very, very useful presentations. I'm going to focus much more narrowly in my discussion on what's going on at the Federal Communications Commission. Obviously, there's policy issues relating to access in lots of other places, but I'm going to do that narrow focus, and it's going to be kind of legalistic. I warn you in advance. But I do want to start with, because Dr. Wilson's historical presentation was wonderful and deeply grounded the framework for where we got to here, and the difficulties and obstacles that have been encountered for broadening access all along the way. I would add that our colleague in the public interest colleague at Free Press, Joe Torres, and Juan Gonzalez, who many of you will know from Democracy Now!, co-wrote a terrific history that covers, it starts back a ways, but mostly focuses on the last several decades of the effort to try to gain access for diverse voices in the media. And if you were interested in Dr. Wilson's presentation, I would encourage you to take a look at this. It's called News for All the People, the Epic Story of Race and the American Media. And I mention that both to dovetail with Dr. Wilson, but also because some of the material that it's discussed in there is prelude to what I'm going to talk about. From the time the Federal Communications Commission was established in 1934, it ratified, reified, left in place many of the discontinuities and exclusions that typified America as of 1934 and the decades that followed. The FCC licensed segregationist universities to get broadcasting stations. It looked the other way at blatant race discrimination in the use of airwaves that belonged to the public. This started to come to an end in the 1960s with litigation in Jackson, Mississippi, brought by my former employer at the United Church of Christ Office of Communication, that gave viewers and listeners the right to participate in FCC proceedings, and led to a focus on changing the policies to try to take into account the incentives to create ownership opportunities for minorities and women in broadcasting. Contemporaneously, the civil rights community also, and I'm proud to say this, I was involved in this, the civil rights community forced the Federal Communications Commission to adopt rules creating affirmative action for first broadcasters and then cable companies in their employment practices, and to remarkable effect. Starting in the 70s, the diversity of employment in the broadcasting industry far outstripped other areas of the mass media because of the incentives and the pressure that the Federal Communications Commission was able to employ. The diversity policies and ownership initially had some very useful effect. I don't know how many people here are familiar with the fact that the reason that there is a WHUR-FM in this building or next door is because the FCC had ownership policies that incented the Washington Post, which owned the frequencies, to give the station to Howard in order to free itself up for other activities and to avoid regulatory obstacles. So there initially was some considerable progress, but it proved to be very difficult, and Federal Communications Commission over time in both Democratic and Republican administrations proved reluctant to press very hard to push these initiatives. There is not a regulatory peg that gives the government the same ability to pressure cable companies and certainly print and now internet content providers. So even though broadcasting may be in relative terms less dominant or less important today, my co-panelist has arrived here. Come on around, Jocelyn. Just come on up and sit down. Don't wait for me to stop or anything. The leverage of broadcasting continues to be very important, even if broadcasting is less dominant part of the media today than it has been in the past, and serves as a kind of guidepost, and also a can be an entry level for opportunities in the media. Unfortunately, we have had very little success. As Dr. Wilson mentioned, we actually went to the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Third Circuit, a case called Prometheus Radio. Actually, there's now been 3 decisions, Dr. Wilson, and we filed the 4th one not long ago. trying to force the FCC to actually collect and analyze data about the diversity of ownership in broadcasting on the proposition, which the court has already agreed with us on, is that the FCC should not be able to repeal or change or modify its regulations about ownership of broadcasting unless and until it can assess the impact of those changes on minority and female ownership. But the fact that we're having to go to court to do it, and the fact that the court keeps telling the FCC to do it, the FCC keeps not doing it, is a matter of great frustration. This litigation has been underway since 2001. And as I just said, we're in court for the fourth time, basically pushing for the same thing. So it is a difficult struggle, and now I bring it today. It's not going to get any easier. After a lot of progress and being on the offensive for the last 8 years in a number of areas, we are now completely on the defensive, and the new FCC chair, as you've already heard, is bent on what I can only characterize as a radical reversal of policies designed to promote diversity in various media outlets. I'm going to go over some of this very quickly just to give you a feel for what's going to happen, and we're not going to be able to stop all these bullets, I'm afraid. Carmen has discussed privacy rules, so I'll not discuss that. But your information, when you browse online, is being exploited. There's also been some allusion to Lifeline. The Federal Communications Commission voted to expand the Lifeline subsidies so that they can be used not just for telephones, but for broadband access. And the new FCC chairman has already overturned 9 companies that were designated as to be authorized to provide broadband service under the Lifeline program nationally. He's overturned 9 of those already. There's been allusions to network neutrality, which is a really fundamental way of lowering barriers to access to the internet. I'm actually more optimistic that we will be able to retain the network neutrality rules in court in the end than on some of the other things that we've got. But it's clear that the chairman intends to move to undo the regulations that were adopted. Hi, Mom. Does that work? Okay. Were adopted with respect to network neutrality. In the media ownership area, as I've indicated, the FCC has not a lot of authority, and the Justice Department weighs in on this in terms of concentration of ownership. In broadcasting, while we have the rules that I've alluded to, we've been able to hold the line on those without getting this minority and female ownership data that we want and need. The new FCC chairman has made it plain that he intends to repeal these rules as quickly as possible, starting as early as next month, with something that is very, very hyper-technical called the UHF discount. But without getting into what it is or explaining how it came to be, the FCC repealed it. The new FCC is going to reinstate it, and the effect of this is going to be to allow large broadcast television owners to acquire other stations. Sinclair, which has already bought Channel 7 here in D.C., is hot on the trail of a huge chain of stations owned by Tribune all over the country, and will become much bigger and much more powerful. And as some of you may have read some of the investigative reporting in the Washington Post, Sinclair has an especially cozy relationship with President Trump, so that's a source of considerable concern. We will be looking, in addition to repeal of these ownership rules, we will be looking at huge mergers and an FCC, to the extent that it even gets involved, that will be more than willing to accommodate those mergers. For technical reasons, again, that I won't go into, the chairman is taking a pass on even asserting jurisdiction over the HCT Time Warner merger that's pending. Last year, after the FCC and the Justice Department blocked Comcast from buying Time Warner Cable, the FCC did allow a smaller company, Charter, to purchase Time Warner Cable, but it was done with a sweetener, a condition that was going to expand broadband deployment to underserved areas around the country. And Chairman Pai is about to take away that sweetener and free Charter from that obligation, which it agreed to do as a condition for that merger. LPFM, which I have a deep personal stake in, low power FM radio, community radio stations, non-commercial stations all over the country. We've got 1,500 of them now on the air, are under threat, and a number of them may be knocked off of the air by some regulatory changes that the FCC chairman has already put in place. So it is going to be difficult to maintain momentum. It is going to be a defensive fight for a considerable number of years, and access for people who have traditionally been underserved, and access for those people to speak and to be heard, is going to be a very difficult thing to accomplish in the next 3 years, 10 and a half months at the least. So I'm afraid I don't have a very rosy outlook for you today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joycelyn Tate. I'm the Senior Technology Policy Advisor with the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, it is a mouthful, and the Black Women's Roundtable. And what I want to talk to you about today, my colleague just mentioned, Andy Schwartzman just mentioned that it doesn't look rosy going down the road, but we still have to lean in. There's a lot of people I heard talking after this last presidential election. They threw their hands up as far as advocacy is concerned and said, oh, this is, we may as well just run to Canada. But we still have to lean in. We still have to lean in and engage this administration. So what I want to talk to you about today is a few quick advocacy strategies that we need to consider as we approach this administration on our issues. And the first one I would say is start to advocate early and often. Once you execute quickly an advocacy strategy and make your elected officials make it known to the elected officials in this administration what your key priorities are, you can get them in before the playing field gets too noisy. And it's March now. We're still in the first 100 days. I would say, as far as advocacy is concerned, looking from now and in the future, you have to get it in early. So that you can at least have a seat at the table and at least they know what your issues are, and then you can continue to engage from there. The second thing that I would say is one of the most important things for advocacy is face-to-face meetings. You have to be in the room. We have to remain in the room, and that's one of the most effective forms. Now, I know there are people that have had meetings with this administration or the majority Republican Congress now, and people have been criticized for it. But you have to be there. If you're not there, no one can know what your issues are. So that is very important. And there's two types of advocacy, and I'll just tell you what I call it. I call it the advocacy of you need to do it because it's the right thing to do, which is kind of like that, and sometimes it's called like the shaming for bad behavior, which causes people to raise their eyebrows, and this results in like punitive policies and regulations. Or there's the positive incentives, which offers rewards and encourages better behavior. Now, this administration will probably not respond as well, from what we've seen so far, I don't think they're going to be as responsive to the do it because it's the right thing to do or the shaming approach. So as we approach advocacy, we have to look at it from a positive incentives aspect, which may be a better advocacy, which means for this administration, because it is more focused on deregulation, it appears to be more pro-business than it is consumer. The positive incentives would be, what is the business case for your advocacy? So your advocacy will still be the same, but you may have to retool it and change the packaging of the messaging in order for it to be more receptive to this administration. What is the business case for your advocacy? And I'm going to tell you, particularly a few months ago, I was in a meeting with someone from the Trump transition team who said that rephrasing your advocacy is going to be very important for this administration. So instead of saying things like the digital divide, you would say digital opportunity. And what you would try to do is explain give the business case for what this digital opportunity is. Increasing access to technology to underserved communities, communities that have been traditionally underserved or not served, it increases revenue for a business. So start to make the business case, repackage your advocacy. Also, understanding and doing advocacy, particularly for the Congress, because people are concerned about the majority Republican Congress. Understand that even within the Republican Congress, there are fractions within the Congress, among the Republicans. So even though the legislators don't all agree. So when you rephrase your advocacy, look for those fractions and try to align yourself with those members of the legislature that you feel that can more closely align with your position. And also, I want to say that traditionally, particularly minority groups have always aligned themselves with certain strategic partners and just played this thing of these are our strategic partners and they've traditionally been and this is how we're going forward. Well, in this administration, I would say a new tactic or a new strategy to use is you just can't play in the same sandbox with your same players. You have to broaden your perspective on who your traditional partners are and start to align yourself with others and reach out to other partners that you may not have thought of before. Now, this doesn't mean that you compromise your agenda. It just means you look to broaden your scope of potential partners on issues that you may be aligned with. And so those are my particular advocacy strategies going forward because, as my colleague just said, it may not be rosy going ahead, but we still have to lean in and we still have to engage. And so those who complain about people who are engaging with this administration, that is the only way that you're going to get your voice heard and maybe get something out of this administration. So with that, without going over some of the regulatory issues, again, I'll leave it at that. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks so much to all of you for such stimulating and troubling, in some cases, messages. I'm sure that we will have many questions about these. Do the students with the microphones, could you make yourselves known? Are there a couple of you? Do we have the microphones? Is that one? Do we just have one today? Okay, so I know you all came with something to ask, so this is your opportunity. You heard about the history, you heard about the legislative landscape, what's going on in the FCC, and you heard about strategies for advocacy. And so let's see what more we can say about that. And if you would please identify yourself, and if I could, because we're taping today, if the panelist would be nice enough to rephrase the question.
Yeah, my name is Arvind Nandedkar. I'm in the College of Medicine. I came here to Howard in 1968, and 1968 was one of the best years for Howard for various advocacy and everything. My question to the panel is, how can we handle when the communication comes out in avalanches indicating alternate facts and the fake news and other things? So people are now looking at people of color or people of other origins, how you speak, how you look, as different. And as you know, the recent case in Kansas has happened that they called Indians as Arabs and Indians, and all things are happening. So it is not the only ruling, but it is, we want to see how best, you say only defensive, I would say how other ways it can be promoted so that the real news comes out through the media of all the ways instead of, cowering back. And that's my question. Thank you.
Did you want to direct it to anyone in particular?
Please, anyone can.
Okay.
Well, the short answer is in my area of expertise, which is federal regulation of communications, there is not a lot that can be accomplished to address those problems. We have a First Amendment, and we have a increasingly diverse, I would say wild and woolly media environment that is outside the scope of even the kinds of things that the Federal Communications Commission can do. It has limited authority over broadcasting and even more limited authority over cable, and that's it. Nor do we want to get into directing content or in censoring content. So there's very, very little we can do. Historically, without too much success, we have tried to address the kinds of problems that you talk about through the policies I was discussing before. The theory, and it's been proven to the limited extent we've been able to succeed, that when you broaden the diversity of people who work in the mass media, when you broaden the diversity of ownership in the mass media, you address some of the stereotypes, some of the misreporting, some of the bad information that was characterized by today what we would call the mainstream media. However, the kinds of problems you're talking about, which relate to Facebook algorithms and relate to the fact that anybody can can put up a website and make it look kind of official, where many of the real problems will have to be addressed by engaging with companies outside the scope of direct regulatory authority, like Google and Facebook, and getting them to modify their algorithms and become socially responsible in how they run their platforms, and in addressing the lack of media literacy on part of the public, need for education, for people to tell the difference between some guy in Romania who puts up a website that looks kind of authentic and tell the difference between that and the website for for a serious journalistic operation. That's going to be very, very difficult.
Hi, my name is Annette Lang, and I work at WHUT, PBS station. In reference to advocacy and getting with other organizations, like how would you do the research to identify these organizations? Like, is it through, like, your organization? Do you go on your website and, like, how do you find out that information? And then the next question was in reference to the factions within Congress. Do we go on their websites to find out, or is it like communications website that we can go to that relates to certain senators or representatives that are on, the board? I mean, as far as advocacy, how do you identify?
Well, first, as far as starting to look, as I said, outside of your normal sandbox for other strategic partners, sometimes it is doing Google searches, looking at the positions of certain organizations that they post on their websites. And when you're in the advocacy policy space, a lot of times you run into people from different organizations that you may know have had maybe on some issues may have been different than yours, may have had a position that was different from yours, but on certain issues they may align with you. And like I said again, you're not compromising your agenda, but looking at ways we can partner on certain things to get certain things done. Or it could be a situation where you don't have anything, your agendas don't collide, but you've just never considered partnering with them before. So you have to, that's how you have to look at it. Looking outside of your sandbox, doing a little bit of research to find out what other organizations are out there that on particular issues have the same agenda that you do. So those are some ways to do it. Now, as far as looking at maybe the factions that go on in Congress, as far as the different the parties are concerned, one way you can do it is go to their websites, give them a call, find out where they stand on this issue or that issue. They'll tell their staff will tell you. You can also do a simple Google search to find out what the positions they've had. You can go online to find out the bills that they have put forth and who may have sponsored them, or if they died before they got out of committee. And if it's a bill that you're interested in, I'll give you one example. One of the most effective ways in increasing minority ownership in the media was the FCC's minority tax certificate. That increased my minority ownership in broadcast media tenfold for 15 years until it was discontinued by Congress. There have been Congress people on the Hill who have tried to revive that.
Including some Republicans.
And yes, and Republicans, but it has just never taken off. That is one thing that if you want to advocate, go to them. Try to get that traction going again. So that's why I'm saying doing the research, finding, it's going to take a little bit of research on your part, because when we're used to working in a certain, within a certain realm and approaching advocacy from a certain way, it's kind of hard to realize you've got to step outside of your comfort zone now going forward, and in order to push your agenda forward. So those are, to answer your question, those are two things that you can do.
Go ahead. So one of the other things I just wanted to follow up with, if you want a place to start, in the House, so in Energy and Commerce, the Communications and Technology Subcommittee has several members. So I just mentioned the chair, which is Marsha Blackburn, but there's a whole list of members, and I think that would be a good place to start on the House side, and then also to look at the membership of the Senate Communications Subcommittee. And that's the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So, the Senate Committee on Science, Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So I think that would be a good place.
Thank you.
Start.
Hi, my name is Colin Campbell. I'm a first-year doctoral student here at Howard University, and that's a good segue. I wanted to ask, how much confidence do you think that you have in the Senate Commerce Committee's commitment to securing citizens' privacy rights as we continue to expand broadband? Do you think this is a wash, or do you think that there's some will there to protect citizens' privacy?
Well, as Carmen was saying, we're going to get a test of that very, very soon because the FCC adopted rules that would continue to protect the privacy of people browsing the internet, and Congress has a resolution on a fast track that would strip those rights, and they have 6 weeks or so deadline within which they're either going to act or not act, and we'll have a pretty good idea about what the Senate is going to do or not do in terms of protecting the public in that time. More broadly, more than some of the other issues relating to access, there is something of a coalition with libertarians on the right and progressives on the left to protect privacy. For the most part, it's been manifested in the Fourth Amendment area and in surveillance areas. My organization, for example, has filed complaints with the Federal Communications Commission over the racial discrimination in the use of devices called stingrays. These are surveillance devices that capture cell phone signals, and we filed a complaint against the Baltimore Police Department because they were using it only in African American communities, and they're arguably unlawful under the Communications Act for the police department to have used it. So in that and other similar kinds of surveillance areas, there has been a coalition. We have hoped that we could expand that coalition to get more conservative support in terms of protecting privacy rights. Thus far, without as much success as we might have hoped.
Hello, I am a first-year doctoral student, also a student of Dr. Byerly's, and I wanted to thank you guys for coming to present your findings to us. I was particularly interested in Dr. Wilson's presentation on the historical ramifications for accessing voting rights. That was very interesting. But I wanted to talk to Dr. Schwartzman about, or Mr. Schwartzman about what you just said about privacy rights. I did hear recently about how they're using technology to track to invade on people's privacy with the use of technologies like Alexa and smart televisions. And I know that they were using cell phones also to do the privacy invasion. So what is your take on the new technologies that they're using to invade on individuals?
Well, there's no, this is really complicated stuff. I was just last night talking with a colleague of mine who is a real privacy expert, unlike me, and who also is a software engineer before he became a law professor, so he understands this stuff. We were kind of amused that in the revelations on Tuesday with respect to the CIA's practices that were subject to leaks from WikiLeaks, one of the things that was described in the articles was the fact that Samsung smart TVs can be hacked to be turned into surveillance devices. And the reason that was amusing, maybe the wrong word, was that unlike some of the other things that were described by WikiLeaks and were in the articles that related to at least surprised that some of these technologies might exist and being used, this smart TV thing was just kind of lumped into the articles as if this was equally shocking. It isn't equally shocking. People in the technology world and the tech journalists and so forth know this full well, and the journalists that were writing these stories ought to have said, and some of them should have known this, is what we're talking about, is that they were doing this, that, and the other thing with iPhones and Android phones and so forth. Plus, the WikiLeaks information revealed that they were also using reasonably well-known techniques to hack Samsung smart TVs. Everybody in my world, everybody knows that you can hack these internet-connected TV sets, and indeed, as recently as 2 weeks ago, the Federal Trade Commission entered into a settlement against a different smart TV manufacturer, Vizio, for, I can't remember, $20 million or something, because they were failing to follow appropriate guidelines for protecting the information they were collecting from their smart TVs. So this is out there, and a lot of this comes under the jurisdiction of the Federal Trade Commission. There are all sorts of fights with the Europeans over when and how we regulate and address these practices in general. The Federal Communications Commission took these very proactive, positive steps to regulate information that would be collected during browsing, which is what I was talking about before, but there's all of these other ways that information is collected. The Federal Trade Commission, which is a tiny agency charged with regulating everything in U.S. commerce, can only go after really serious abuses, with one major exception. And that's where we've made some headway, and where we've been able to try to educate the public about the dangers more broadly. There is a separate law called the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, that actually gives the Federal Trade Commission broader authority when companies are collecting information about children. How many people know about Hello Barbie? This doesn't seem like a Hello Barbie crowd. There's Hello Barbie. There's another doll called Kayla, and there's also, as recently as this week, an interactive teddy bear, which the Germans just acted on. These are all interactive toys that are internet connected. So you talk to Hello Barbie, and you say, "Hi Barbie," and this goes from Barbie to their internet server, and Barbie responds, "Hi, how are you?" And Barbie will say, "How old are you?" And the child will say, "I'm 4." And Barbie will say, "That's very nice, you're 4." Sort of like Siri has these conversations. All of that information is collected and recorded. The Federal Trade Commission is moving on some of this, and there was a huge breach with this interactive teddy bear, where not only were they collecting the information and not adequately protecting it, but the failure to adequately protect it resulted in a hack, and the Germans just acted because the manufacturer of the data collected by the teddy bear was widely available on the dark net by hackers, and information about children was being bought and sold on the internet. So we have massive problems here, and a very inadequate regulatory framework with which to deal with it. And we have an industry-friendly Congress that is thus far loath to do much about it. As I said before, this does cross political lines a little bit, and some of the libertarians share some of these concerns, but a lot is going to happen, and there's going to be a lot of vulnerabilities until such time, if ever, when we get adequate legislative protection.
And can I add, this is particularly troubling now that we're moving more into the age of the Internet of Things, where we have connected homes, where your refrigerator's connected, your lights are connected, your thermostat is connected, and everything is connected. So this is, we're going to see probably more and more of this until regulation is in place, which is, the technology is moving faster than the regulation can catch up, which is problematic.
I have a question. I have a professor's type question. So we have 3 attorneys and 1 scholar on the podium here, and I'm wondering, we're social scientists here in this department that's sponsoring today's event. What are the sorts of social science research that are needed by, say, those on the front lines doing legal advocacy sorts of things?
Well, I would say, when I was talking about making the business case for for your advocacy positions, certainly we need the research in order to make the business case. So the research on crunching the numbers about why this is important for business, for you to have more people connected from underserved communities, how much money that will generate for a business. These are certainly things, the research that we as advocates need. A lot of times in my advocacy work, I'm always going to Pew and all of these other places to bolster my advocacy position. So as far as what advocates need from the scholars, we definitely need the research. We need the numbers. We need those numbers that are crunched so that we can go out and make our position stronger.
In the broadest sense, a lot of the information that would be helpful is really in the economic sphere. It's market share data. It is usage data about practices. We are moving out of an area where even the traditional commercial data sources that we have relied on for media consumption, figuring out market share and things like that, are becoming unavailable. Netflix knows how many people watch Orange is the New Black. That's a trade secret. Unlike a TV show that for the last 70 years would get a Nielsen rating, Netflix, to its financial advantage, doesn't tell anyone how many people watch the shows that it runs, because that gives it an advantage in negotiating. If the producers of Orange is the New Black don't know how many people watch it, don't know how successful it is, they don't know how much to ask for the next season of the show. So more and more internet surfing information, page views, content information is becoming less and less available. So it is increasingly difficult to track market share, to track usage and practices, and to figure out if there are disparities, to figure out if there are discontinuities, or to put it in the other way, historically, because of deficiencies in the ratings services, minority communities were undercounted by the broadcast rating services. This was a massive problem, especially in radio, but in television and cable television as well. It's harder to get ratings for homes where minorities and people lacking access reside and use the information, and for their mobile usage and so forth. And so it was difficult for minority-oriented, still is difficult for minority-oriented programmers to sell advertising based on what their true audiences are. So there too, the need is for more and better data, and to deal with this problem that more and more of this data is increasingly unavailable to scholars.
So I agree with both of those. And one of the things I wanted to add too is, and this is not necessarily just data, but something that would be very helpful in our advocacy work, is to find stories of people that have been impacted by these regulations and the impact that these deregulations would have on these people. And I think it's something that, we see them here and there, but to have stories collected, especially with Lifeline, for example. I mean, that Lifeline is, it's a federal program. It does provide a modest subsidy for communications tools, so it's $9.25 a month. And now that it's expanded into broadband, it has this potential to bridge the digital divide for a lot of low-income families. But if we take that away, what is the impact? Like, who are the families? Who are the children who won't have broadband at home because of these deregulations? So I think that's also should be part of the research moving forward.
Thank you.
I just wish to echo some of the challenges faced by the social scientists with respect to data collection. If we have algorithm for Facebook viewers, for instance, or YouTube viewers that are being manipulated by the machines, how valid is the data to be be collected by the social scientists. Andrea Guzman just published an article from Illinois University about machines and communication, machines taking the place of human communication on CMC. So how reliable is the data when we know the data has been manipulated? So how are we going to report the data as accurate when machines are dealing with this data? The big data era that we are dealing with is a big challenge for us. So how reliable are these data when we know that the machines are handling them for us? So how can we accurately address this issue for advocacy, for instance, when we know that 115 views is not right? Maybe it was just 10, but it was exploded.
Well, it's a great question as to which there's no great answer. I would reiterate what I said before, which is to back up. There are lots of questions about how good and reliable the data has ever been, going back to day one. So a lot of research has been built on the best available data, which may not be so great. There's huge disparities between not huge, there's significant disparities between the viewing data that Nielsen turns up for television and a competing company called Rentrack, which collects its data in a different way using cable boxes, gets the information. In radio, when they switched from the diaries, people used to write down what they were listening to on the radio in diaries, and they switched to a passive method that was more automatic, the ratings changed significantly. So the data was never perfect to begin with, and now in the internet age, where when people have X number of Twitter followers, it's entirely possible that half of them are bots to begin with. And you can buy followers. If you want to have a large number of followers, you can go on the internet and buy 10,000 followers. So people look and see you have a lot of followers. So we've got a very challenging environment under the best of circumstances. This is not the answer, and hardly solves the problem. But I would point out that at the far ends of this, you've got big companies, Facebook most prominently, who are coming out and telling their advertisers and telling the Securities Exchange Commission, hey, we've just discovered that our page views that we've been reporting to advertisers and using for selling advertising are really wrong. We were overstating certain kinds of page clicks. That gets into the area of unfair trade practices and things that the Federal Trade Commission and the state attorneys generals can go after and can create some best practices and some outer boundaries. But that's the kind of thing that can be done on the edges. But I don't have a simple good answer for what is an increasingly difficult problem where there are very few incentives for the people who have the right data to share it.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Goodman. I'm a first year.
Can't hear you.
My name is Jasmine Goodman. I'm a first year doctoral student. So I wanted to make a quick point regarding Mr. Schwartzman's comment about buying followers. So recently, we have been seeing platforms that have been wiping dummy accounts. And so I know with Instagram, we saw like somebody may have had like 1.5 million followers, and now they may have like 10,000 because they may have actually only had 10,000 legitimate followers. So there are some measures being taken on a very small scale, but we are starting to see where we're no longer relying on, what we see in their profile, but we're also, the company is kind of taking proactive measures. But I did want to take this time to make an announcement. There is a conversation happening online, so if you all want to use a hashtag HMGchat, you can post questions and comments, and we'll be asking those to our panelists. So please take this opportunity to do so.
Good evening. This question is for
Can't hear you.
Okay, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This question is for Dr. Wilson. I'm currently studying your book, sexism, racism, sexism in the media. I am a first-year doctoral student, and I'm interested in research on the representation of women of color in media, on and off screen. I'm also an educator in communications and a parent of a first-year college student who studies communications. So my question is, what are some ways we can inspire our youth to become advocates for changing media policies as we move beyond history?
Ooh. Another one that's difficult to answer. It sort of strikes at the heart of one of our problems that exists certainly in the African American community, but also elsewhere, and that is our communities aren't that well versed on communications issues or even the importance of communications. So a lot of this begins with education. Why is it important that communications entities be held accountable for the kinds of things that we see? There's my experience with a lot of younger people. They're fascinated by the technology, and they're great users, but they don't think beyond using the device. Okay, and they don't think, about privacy issues. I'm not sure they think all that much about how can I get into that industry. Now that gets to be increasingly more of the getting into engineering and those, software design, that kind of stuff. But it is sort of a problem getting people to realize how important this is. It's sort of like communications is something that one sort of takes for granted. As to the issue of employment, not very encouraging there either. We're finding that that in some communications areas, the numbers have declined. No one in the area of let's say our online news services, they aren't even reporting their hires. We don't know who works for them. We have no demographic data. They don't feel obliged. In the old media, like the broadcasting, over-the-air broadcasting and newspapers and magazines, the American Society of News Editors had been keeping data, which the members voluntarily gave, how many African Americans, how many Latinos, et cetera. They've gotten out of that business, basically. So it's hard to get numbers. But the sort of the anecdotal material we see, for example, I was follow what's his name, Richard Prince's journalisms, and we see announcements in there all the time about so-and-so has left NBC, or so-and-so is no longer with Facebook, or this, and yet I don't see, sort of similar kinds of notices about people getting hired in these places. And so I don't have anything encouraging to say. It's, how does one get a job at one of these places? I'm at a loss. I know that the tendency, a few years ago I was at, I spent the summer working at usatoday.com, and having myself come out of the newspaper industry, it was quite a revelation, quite a shock to see the people in that newsroom at USA Today. Whereas the people used to, when you talk to somebody and you're getting acquainted and you say, well, where were you before you were here? And they would say, well, I used to be at the New York Times, or, you know, I used to be at St. Louis Post-Dispatch or whatever. Nowadays, you ask them where they've been and they say, well, I was at Microsoft. Okay. Or, you know, so the industry is changing. It's kind of hard for me to assess this because everything is, you know, as you go through this technological revolution, everything is changing, everything is fluid, and it's hard to get numbers and data. So I wish I had a better answer, but I do think that first and foremost, we've got to be more cognizant of the need to inform and educate our community, starting with young people, how important it is that we have a foothold and a stake in the communications industries, because this is how they're supposed to be a mirror of our society. And some of the things we see, we'd hate to think, starting with the president, but you know, we hate to think that, is this where we are right now? Are these the values? Are these the ideals that we want to see communicated over, in a lot of cases, over our public airwaves? So I've sort of rambled on this, but it's a very difficult question to tackle. It's very challenging. But I'd like to start there. We also, when we talk about ownership, how does one, we know it takes money, okay? So that's problematic in a lot of cases. The day has passed where, you know, you could take a side job like Willis Hodges, get some money together and start your own, you know, blog or website. And it's a very tough nut to crack. But it has to be done. And probably, I know we hate to infringe on First Amendment and those kinds of things, but it may come to us having to make some kinds of regulatory or restrictions or encourage people to do something better than what they're doing now. You know, some requirements to do that. In journalism, almost everybody now thinks they're a journalist. They got a computer and get online. They start their blogs. Some of them are quite good, but many of them are not. And they have nefarious motives and that kind of thing. So I wish I could encourage you, but it's a tough one. And I just see things in flux, and we see less and less regulation. That's happening, and it's just sort of frightening. But we'll overcome somehow.
If I can just piggyback on what the professor said a moment ago, you were talking about employment and how the numbers are drastically dropping, or flatlining almost for people of color. We know that broadcasting was one of the first federally regulated industries that was required to have equal employment regulations. And I think one of the advocacy points that we could make towards that is looking at the tech industry. Just like the government has regulated employment in broadcasting, it may be time to look at employment regulation in the tech industry, or and something that the Department of Labor could look at now. In this age, in this administration of less regulation, it's going to be hard to make that case, but once again, maybe trying to frame it in a way that would make it more appealing to the regulators. Also, I wanted to speak to the point he was talking about people being users, particularly people of color being users of technology and not creators. one of the things that people are doing, and I know I have participated in and done it myself, is to have events where you bring in young people and bring them and show them how, and they're called hackathons, to show them how to create their own technologies. Because with technology, I think a lot of times the reason we don't understand or get more people of color in it is because they really, it's just like it's something that I see it on my phone, but I don't really know the backstory. I don't know the back end, how it really happens. Because in an industrial world, if you see a smokestack, you know there's a factory, so you know there's jobs there. So people go and they look for the jobs. You know, in an agricultural era, there were fields with corn or whatever growing. So you know there's jobs there because I see the field and I see the corn. So I can go there and get a job. But with the technology industry, you see people go in a building, you don't really know why they're going in there, and then you see them come out. And so you don't know what they're doing in there, but they're creating technologies. So I think what we have to do is break open, let people see, hey, this is how it's done. Break open those doors so you can see that how it's done. Because there are tech hubs. I mean, Georgia Avenue, running up Georgia Avenue is DC's tech hub. But I was having a conversation with someone the other day that is in the building down on Georgia Avenue across the street from the Metro, and I was telling them, yeah, that WeWork space, they do tech things. She was like, I see people go in and out of there all the time. I didn't know what they did in there. So, and you know, so, you know, we have to expose our younger people to these industries, to these as viable industries for them to work in, to create in, to have entrepreneurship in.
Thank you for those comments. Those lead actually right into the question that I have. I'm Erin Horn McKinney. I am a first-year doctoral student as well. And I wanted to speak to the fact that women and minority ownership in traditional media continues to be on the decline. And there's emerging data that documents similar limited female and minority ownership in the digital media space, which is what we've been speaking to just now. What are some policy issues or advocacy points that we as social scientists can work on to address these growing concerns? And that speaks to employment. It also speaks to being tech founders and tech owners, because what we've seen in traditional media is where that leads to the generational wealth. And we've seen individuals like Sheila Johnson and Oprah Winfrey, who are some of the wealthiest black women in the country due to media ownership, and how can we continue to see that in future media ownership?
Well, I'll speak to like the tech industry or even the wireless industry. We've got, I would say one of the things would be to mirror something that was done in the broadcast industry with the tax certificate, and that is to incentivize the sale of spectrum from larger companies to women and minority buyers. That's something that could happen. Also, excuse me, we know that, as everybody in here has said, minority media ownership is hemorrhaging. And it's looking, and it was hemorrhaging even before this administration came into place. So this is not something that we can say this administration caused. And it's hemorrhaging for various reasons: access to capital problems, advertising discrimination, and so on. But again, one thing that I will reiterate again, the single most thing that significantly increased minority ownership in the media was the minority tax certificate. So that is something else that we could advocate for. As social scientists, that's where we need you to do the research to help bolster our positions on that.
Just kind of putting a plug in for the tax certificate again, back in the fall, the School of Communications here became the Cathy Hughes School of Communications. And Cathy Hughes, being the owner of the largest, at least at one time, probably still, non-white owned broadcast company, conglomerate. And she has said publicly that she would not be able to do what she did in buying up her stations if it hadn't been for the tax certificate, and probably also the distress sale, which nobody actually has mentioned.
Well,
but
I hate being a Debbie Downer. Throwing a wet blanket over all of this. The history of the tax certificate policy is important and interesting, because it had considerable success. And when Newt Gingrich came in after the 1994 election, in his so-called first 100 days, when he had a contract with America, which is before some of you were born, they overturned a bunch of things very quickly. One of the things they did was enact the Congressional Review Act that Carmen was talking about at the start of our session. But they also repealed the tax certificate policy. And there's been a lot of effort to try to get it reinstated ever since. It's 23 years. But the way the tax certificate policy works is this. Where companies engaged in media transactions are required to make divestitures in order to comply with regulations, they were allowed to defer the capital gains taxes on the sale of those properties. So if a property was going to be sold for $100, the capital gains tax was going to be $20 if they sold to a minority. And so they would make the sales price $90 and thereby reduce the acquisition cost to the minority by $10 and make it easier to get financing and easier to get a competitive advantage. And they'd get to keep $10 for themselves as a bonus or bribe, if you insist, for participating in the policy. And it was very successful. From what I described, the success of the tax certificate policy depends on having broadcast ownership rules or other media ownership rules that limit the degree of concentration of control of ownership and require broadcasters to have to sell or divest properties in order to comply with the rules. When you deregulate the rules, you don't have any opportunity to sell stations and use the tax certificate policy. So deregulation that I talked about at the start of this thing, every bit of deregulation makes the tax certificate policy less and less valuable.
Well, in talking about incentivizing, like for instance for the spectrum, selling of spectrum, instead of the regulations that would be punitive, maybe look at advocacy regulations that would incentivize. I mean, that would be that would give some kind of benefit for those selling the spectrum.
Right, and just to build off of that, really to speak specifically to regulation recommendations to the tech industry, right? Because that's where we're seeing new media ownership going, and so and what we've talked about as it relates to employment and even ownership and advertising and that sort of thing. That's a completely, for the most part, unregulated space. So what are some regulation recommendations that the panel might have for the tech space as it relates to female and minority ownership in that space and potentially even employment as well?
Well, the tech community has gotten away with a lot. And when they've been forced to do any kind of self-disclosures, they have been shocking in what information they've voluntarily put out. Certainly, one thing we could do, and the right Congress could do, would be to adopt regulations similar to what were in place for some time, but stronger, that companies engaged in interstate commerce have to report their employment profiles, data about their employment activities to the federal government in a way that makes it available to researchers. We used to have more of that, we have less of it, and at a time when we need much more of it.
And so I have, not about regulations, but I actually wanted to put a plug in for a report that I recently read. It's from Open Mic called Breaking the Mold, and it's about increasing diversity in the tech sector. And what stood out to me from that report is that they had some recommendations which I think we could apply, to communications outlets and to media as well, which is one of the recommendations is to engage the white CEOs with positive monetary incentives to increase diversity. So that, because diversity has remained stagnant, so how do you incentivize? So that was one of the recommendations. And the other thing that I thought was interesting about this report is that it talked about, in the tech sector, we talk about the pipeline, like, oh, well, we just need a better pipeline, and then we can increase diversity. But what this report found is that the pipeline isn't really the only issue. The issue is also retention. So not only are people, women and minorities being hired in the tech sector, but they're actually leaving more than 3 times the rate of white men. So how do you solve that problem, right? Like, you have these women and minorities in these positions. How do you keep them? And so they had some recommendations for these companies to create mentoring programs as well as affinity groups, and they thought that could potentially increase diversity as well. So those aren't necessarily regulations, but they are recommendations that I think the tech sector should adopt. And I would advise you to read that report. It was very good.
And I also think, as far as the tech sector is concerned, for the practice, one thing that would be more convincing for the tech sector to increase its minority and women employment and keep them from leaving is to shift their paradigm of thinking of diversity as a human resource issue to an issue of being relevant in the future for future success in business. Because when you as this country is going from minority groups becoming the minority, the business case for this is you need people in those decision-making positions in the tech industry that understand how to make the business relevant. From a human resource standpoint, it's like we just get the numbers. Okay, we got the numbers of minorities, we have the number of women. So I think a business case, making the business case of shifting the paradigm of thinking from diversity and inclusion as just a human resource issue to an issue of being relevant in the survival of your business in the future would be more effective.
Yeah, so a great thanks to all of our panelists for coming and speaking up and sharing their knowledge with us today on issues that I'm sure we will continue to talk about and argue about, hopefully. And also to our audience who came and asked such great questions. I'd like to do a special thanks to the students who ushered today, welcomed people, did the graphics, got the publicity out, and everything. So a big hand for all of us.
I sounds like you had a harrowing afternoon.
Yes, I did. But I got it. That was great. That's a successful, don't you think?
And Candy's going to report his audio of the series right now.
They were talking about
who knows?